It was 11 degrees below freezing in Detroit, Michigan. A 24-year-old delivery driver named Jake Carter was finishing the last run of a 12-hour shift when he heard something behind a dumpster in a dark alley, a faint, rattling cough. He almost kept walking. He was tired. He was hungry. He had $41 to his name and a mother lying in a hospital bed, fighting cancer. He had nothing left to give anyone. But he stopped anyway. What he found in that alley was an old man frozen, confused, unable to remember his own name. Jake didn't know it yet. But in 9 days, that same old man would be sitting in a boardroom on the 40th floor of the tallest building in the city, surrounded by lawyers and executives, fighting to make sure that the only person who treated him like a human being, a broke delivery boy, never went without help again. This is a story about two families who never should have met, about a poor young man with nothing, and an old man who built one of the largest companies in the Midwest and somewhere in between them, a kind of love that money never could have bought. Stay until the end, because what happens in part 14, when Walter looks his own grandson in the eye and can't remember his name but still remembers, Jake's will stay with you for a long, long time. Let's begin. Jake Carter had not always been poor. 3 years earlier, his father, Tom Carter Sr., walked out of the house on a Tuesday morning and never came back. No note, no phone call, just an empty closet and a 17-year-old boy left to figure out how to be the man of the house. By the time Jake turned 24, he had given up 2 semesters of community college, taken every odd job Detroit had to offer, and finally landed steady work as a driver for Speedy Eats, a food delivery app that paid him $3.75 a run, plus tips that rarely came. His mother, Linda Carter, had worked as a hotel housekeeper for 19 years. She raised Jake mostly alone after the divorce, and she never once complained, not when the heat got shut off in February, not when dinner was just buttered toast, not even when she found the lump in her breast and waited 4 months to see a doctor because she couldn't afford to miss a single shift. By the time she finally went in, the cancer had already reached stage 2. Jake remembered the night she told him. She'd sat at their small kitchen table, hands folded, voice steady in the way mothers force themselves to be steady for their children. "It's going to be okay," she'd said. "I just need you to keep doing what you're doing, baby. Keep paying the bills, keep your head up." Jake had nodded, gone to his room, and cried into a pillow so she wouldn't hear him. Now, every night after his shift, he drove 30 minutes to Detroit Mercy Hospital just to sit by her bed for 20 minutes before visiting hours ended. Some nights he brought her a milkshake from the diner where Dorothy, the night waitress, slipped him a free coffee because she knew exactly how thin his wallet had gotten. "You're running yourself into the ground, Jake," Dorothy told him one night, refilling his cup without being asked. "A boy can't pour from an empty cup forever." "I don't have a choice, Dorothy," Jake said quietly. "She's all I've got." He didn't know, on that particular freezing Tuesday night, that his entire life, and the life of a stranger he hadn't met yet, was about to change forever. In less than an hour, Jake would make a choice that most people in his exact situation would never make, and it would cost him the only thing he had left to spare. It was nearly 11 p.m. when Jake pulled up outside an apartment building on 8th Street with his final delivery of the night, a bag of Chinese food, already going cold in the passenger seat. He'd been awake for 16 hours. His feet ached. His phone showed $41.12 in his checking account, with rent due in 4 days. He just wanted to drop the food, collect his $3 tip if he was lucky, and go home. As he walked back toward his car, he heard it, a wet, rattling cough, coming from the narrow alley beside the building. Jake froze. Detroit winters were brutal, and it wasn't unusual to find someone sleeping rough behind a dumpster on a night like this. Most people walked past. Most people had learned to walk past it was safer that way, easier on the heart. Jake almost did the same, but something he would later say he didn't know what, maybe just exhaustion lowering his guard, maybe just his mother's voice in the back of his head made him turn around. He stepped into the alley, the beam of his phone flashlight cutting through the dark. There, slumped against the brick wall, wrapped in a thin coat 2 sizes too big, was an old man. His skin had gone pale, almost gray. His lips had a blue tint Jake had only ever seen on television. Snow had collected on his shoulders, undisturbed, which meant he'd been there a long time without moving. "Sir?" Jake knelt down, his knees soaking through in the slush. "Sir, can you hear me?" The old man's eyelids fluttered, barely opening. "Cold," he rasped. "So cold." Okay, I've got you." Jake's training instincts, years of watching emergency room dramas with his mom on slow nights, kicked in. He checked the man's pulse. Weak, but there. He checked his breathing. Shallow, but steady. "What's your name?" Jake asked. "Can you tell me your name?" The old man's eyes searched Jake's face, confused, frightened. I don't know," he whispered. I can't remember." A chill went through Jake that had nothing to do with the weather. In the next 60 seconds, Jake would make a decision that would put everything he had on the line for a complete stranger. A decision that 9 days later, an entire corporation would owe its survival to. Jake's mind raced through the options. Call 911. That was the obvious answer. Any reasonable person would call 911. He reached for his phone, but the old man's hand shot out and grabbed his wrist with a strength that startled him. "No," the man said, panic flashing across his face. "No hospital. Please. They'll put me somewhere. I won't know how to get back." "Back where, sir?" Jake asked gently. "Do you know where you live?" The old man's face crumpled. "No," he admitted, and the word broke something in his throat. "I don't know anything right now." Jake sat back on his heels, torn. Every practical bone in his body screamed at him to call for help and let professionals handle it. He had nothing to offer, not money, not space, not energy. He was already stretched thinner than a single human being should be stretched. But he thought of his mother, alone in a hospital bed 3 miles away, scared in a system that often made the poor and the elderly feel like burdens instead of people. He thought about how many nights he'd wished anyone would just stay with her so she didn't have to be afraid alone. He made his choice. Jake pulled off his own coat, his only winter coat, a thin black jacket that barely kept the wind out as it was, and wrapped it gently around the old man's shoulders, layering it over the one already there. "Come on," Jake said, sliding an arm under the man to help him up. "I'm not leaving you out here. You're coming with me." It took almost 10 minutes to get the old man into the passenger seat of Jake's rusting Honda Civic. The bag of Chinese food, the order Jake still hadn't delivered, the job that paid his rent, sat forgotten on the dashboard. As Jake pulled away from the curb, the old man turned his head weakly toward him. "Why?" he whispered. "Why would you do this for someone you don't even know?" Jake kept his eyes on the icy road. "Because somebody should," he said simply. "And tonight, I guess that's me." Jake had no idea that the bag of food sitting forgotten on his dashboard would soon be the least important thing he lost that week, or that the man beside him was about to become the most important person to ever sit in that car. Jake's apartment was a single room above a laundromat, a mattress on the floor, a card table that served as a kitchen, and a space heater that only worked if you hit it twice on the side. It wasn't much, but that night it was warm, dry, and safe. And for the old man, that was everything. Jake helped him onto the mattress, piled on every blanket he owned, and heated up a can of soup on the hot plate, the last food in the apartment besides half a loaf of bread. The old man ate slowly, his hands still trembling, color gradually returning to his face. Around midnight, his eyes cleared a little, and he looked at Jake, really looked at him for the first time. "What's your name, son?" he asked, voice stronger now. Jake Carter." The old man nodded slowly, like he was trying to hold on to the information. "Jake," he repeated. Then his brow furrowed in concentration. I think my name might be Walter." "Walter," Jake said. "Good, that's good, Walter. Does anything else come back? Family, where you live?" Walter's face twisted with frustration and something close to grief. "There are pieces," he said quietly. "Flashes. A truck. Boxes. A young man's face, but I can't place it." He pressed a shaking hand to his temple. "It's like trying to hold water in my fists." Jake had seen this before, not personally, but in stories, in movies. "Walter, Do you think you might have dementia? Or Alzheimer's? Walter's eyes filled with tears. I think I might, he whispered. I think that's why I was out there. I think I got lost and I couldn't remember how to ask for help. Jake sat down on the floor beside the mattress, suddenly not feeling tired anymore. Well, you don't have to remember anything tonight, Walter. Tonight, you just have to rest. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow. Together. Walter studied the young man beside him, the threadbare shirt, the exhaustion etched into a face too young to carry it, the complete absence of anything to gain from this kindness. Thank you, Jake, Walter whispered, his eyes finally closing. I don't remember much right now, but I will remember this. I promise you, I will remember this. 40 floors above the city that same night, a man named Daniel Whitfield hadn't slept in 3 days because the grandfather he loved more than anyone in the world had vanished without a trace, and an entire company was about to fall apart trying to find him. The executive floor of Whitfield Tower was silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional ring of a phone nobody wanted to answer. Daniel Whitfield, CEO of Whitfield Foods, a $4 billion food distribution empire that supplied grocery chains across 6 states, sat behind a desk covered in missing person flyers instead of quarterly reports. 5 days. His grandfather, Walter Whitfield, had been missing for 5 days. Walter had founded the company 46 years earlier with a single delivery truck and a dream nobody believed in. He'd built it from nothing into an empire. And 3 years ago, in a quiet ceremony in this very office, he'd handed the keys to Daniel, his only grandson, the boy he'd raised after Daniel's parents died in a car accident when Daniel was just 9 years old. Walter hadn't just been Daniel's grandfather. He'd been his father, his mentor, his entire foundation. And 6 months ago, Walter had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia, a diagnosis the family had fought hard to keep private, both to protect Walter's dignity and to prevent panic among shareholders and the board. 5 days ago, Walter had wandered out of Maple Grove Senior Care during a supervised garden walk, while his usual aide was on a sick day, and a temporary replacement looked away for less than 2 minutes. 2 minutes. That's all it had taken. Sir, Maria Lopez, Daniel's chief of staff, stepped into the office, her face tight with exhaustion that matched his own. She'd barely slept either. Detective Ramirez just called. Still nothing. Cameras lost him near 8th Street 2 nights ago. After that, she paused, choosing her words carefully. After that, there's no trail. Daniel rubbed his eyes. I don't care what it costs, Maria. Double the reward. Put it on every news channel in the state. I want flyers on every corner from here to the river. Sir, the board is asking questions, Maria said gently. Richard Hales specifically. He wants to call an emergency session about succession concerns. Daniel's jaw tightened. Richard Hale, the company's largest non-family shareholder, had spent the last 2 years quietly trying to gain more control over the board, often clashing with Daniel over decisions Walter himself would have approved without hesitation. My grandfather is missing in the freezing cold, Daniel said, voice low and dangerous. And Richard wants to talk about succession. I know, sir. Daniel stood and walked to the window, looking out over the glittering city below somewhere out there. His grandfather was alone, scared, possibly dying, while Daniel sat in an office that meant absolutely nothing without him in it. On his desk sat a faded photograph. Walter, 40 years younger, sleeves rolled up, grinning beside his very first delivery truck. Hang on, Grandpa, Daniel whispered to the empty office. Please, just hang on. 2 miles away, the man Daniel was searching for was sleeping peacefully for the first time in 5 days in the home of a delivery driver who had no idea the old man on his mattress was worth $4 billion to the people desperately searching. For him, Jake woke at 6 a.m. to the smell of his own apartment's space heater working overtime and the sight of Walter sitting upright at the card table, sipping a cup of instant coffee with both trembling hands wrapped around the mug. Morning, Walter said, managing a small smile. Sleep okay? Better than expected. Jake rubbed his eyes and looked at the clock. His shift started in 2 hours, and Linda's hospital visiting hours weren't until evening, which meant he had a problem. He couldn't take Walter to work, couldn't leave him here completely alone in good conscience, and couldn't afford to miss another shift. "Walter, I have to go to work," Jake said carefully. "Do you? Is there anything else coming back to you? Anyone we can call?" Walter's face fell, concentration deepening the lines around his eyes. "Pieces," he said again. "A tall building. A young man's face, dark hair, serious eyes. A name that starts with D, I think. But it slips away the moment I try to hold it." Jake nodded slowly. Okay, we'll figure it out. For now, he had an idea. "There's a woman downstairs, Mrs. Alvarez. Dorothy. She's older, retired. She's home most days. She's the only person in this building I trust. I'm going to ask her to check on you." 20 minutes later, Jake knocked on the door of apartment 2B. Dorothy Alvarez, 71 years old with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, opened the door in her bathrobe, immediately suspicious. "Jake Carter, what trouble have you gotten yourself into now?" Jake explained everything: the alley, the cold, Walter's missing memory. Dorothy's stern expression softened the longer he spoke. "You found a sick old man freezing in an alley and brought him home instead of calling the cops?" she said. "That's either the dumbest thing I've ever heard or the kindest. Knowing your mother, I'm guessing kindest runs in the family. Will you check on him? Just today? I'll figure out what to do tonight." Dorothy was already reaching for her cardigan. "Go to work, baby. I'll keep an eye on him. And Jake," she caught his arm before he left, "you did the right thing. Whoever that man is, somewhere out there, somebody loves him and is scared sick right now. You gave him a chance to get back to them." Jake didn't know how right she was. That same morning, a grainy gas station security photo showing an old man in a coat 2 sizes too big was about to land on the desk of a private investigator hired by Daniel Whitfield, and the search was about to get a whole lot closer to Jake's front door. The private investigator's name was Frank Dolan, a retired Detroit police detective who'd been hired by Whitfield Foods to run a parallel search alongside the official police investigation. Frank had been combing through hours of security footage from every gas station, pharmacy, and corner store within a 2-mile radius of where Walter was last seen. At 7:40 that morning, he found something: a grainy black and white image from a gas station 2 blocks from 8th Street, timestamped 2 nights earlier. An old man, walking unsteadily, wearing a coat that didn't fit him. The timestamp matched the time frame Walter had gone missing. Frank zoomed in. The coat looked institutional, the kind handed out at shelters or care facilities. He cross-referenced it immediately with Maple Grove Senior Care's intake records and confirmed it. That was the coat Walter had been wearing the day he disappeared. Frank called Maria immediately. "I've got a visual. 2 nights ago, 8th Street corridor. He was alone, walking, looked disoriented but mobile. I'm pulling footage from every camera in a 5-block radius from that timestamp forward." Within the hour, the photo was released to local news stations, accompanied by an updated, doubled reward: $100,000 for any information leading to Walter Whitfield's safe return. By noon, Walter's face, blurry but recognizable, was on every news channel in Detroit, scrolling across the bottom of screens in diners, gas stations, and break rooms across the city, including the break room at Speedy Eats, where Jake's co-worker, a 20-year-old named Tommy Briggs, was eating a sandwich during his lunch break. Tommy nearly choked. He dropped off a delivery near Jake's apartment building just yesterday and had passed Jake on the stairs, walking beside an old man in an oversized coat. Tommy stared at the screen, at the $100,000 reward flashing across the bottom, and then pulled out his phone. Tommy had 2 choices: call the tip line himself and claim the reward, or call Jake first and give his friend a chance to do the right thing. What he chose next would test the kind of person he really was. Tommy's thumb hovered over his phone screen, the tip line number glowing on the news broadcast. $100,000. That kind of money could change his life, pay off his car, help his little sister with college, finally move out of his parents' basement. He thought about it for almost a full minute. Then he called Jake instead. Jake, man, turn on the news right now. Tommy said the second Jake picked up, his voice tight with urgency. The old guy you found in that alley, I think? Man, I think he's somebody important. Like, seriously important. Jake, sitting in his car between deliveries, pulled up the local news app on his phone with shaking hands. There it was, Walter's face, blurry but unmistakable, beneath a headline that made Jake's stomach drop. Missing. Walter Whitfield, 78, founder of Whitfield Foods. $100,000 reward for safe return. Jake's mind raced through fear, confusion, and something close to panic. He had a missing billionaire's father, no, grandfather sleeping in his apartment, being watched by his elderly neighbor, and he hadn't told a single authority figure for over 12 hours. Tommy, I gotta go, Jake said, already pulling out of his parking spot. Jake, wait. Tommy's voice turned serious. You're gonna call them, right? You're not gonna. I mean, that's $100,000, man. Nobody would blame you for what, Tommy? Pretending I don't know where he is so I can collect a reward? Jake's voice cracked with something between anger and exhaustion. He's a person, not a lottery ticket. He hung up and called Dorothy immediately. Is he okay? Is Walter okay? He's fine, baby. Sitting right here eating crackers. What's wrong? I'm coming home right now. Don't let him leave, I think. I think I know who he is. As Jake drove, his hands trembled on the wheel, not from fear of getting in trouble, but from a deeper worry that had nothing to do with money. What if the family thought he'd done something wrong? What if a poor kid from a rough part of Detroit, found alone in an apartment with a confused, wealthy old man, looked exactly like the kind of story that ended with handcuffs instead of headlines? Jake's fear wasn't unfounded, but what he didn't know was that the man who built Whitfield Foods from nothing was about to fight harder for Jake's reputation than he'd fought for almost anything else in his life. Jake burst through his apartment door to find Walter exactly where he'd left him, sitting with Dorothy at the small card table, sharing a plate of saltine crackers and peanut butter. Walter, Jake said, breathless, holding up his phone. I think I know who you are. He turned the screen toward him. Walter stared at his own photograph for a long moment, his weathered face shifting through confusion, recognition, and finally a flood of emotion that brought tears to his eyes. That's me, Walter whispered. Whitfield Foods. My God, I remember the trucks. I remember, his voice broke. I remember building it. I remember a boy, Daniel, my grandson, Daniel. Dorothy gripped Jake's arm, her own eyes wide. Jake, that's a $100,000 reward on the screen. I don't care about that right now, Jake said, and he meant it completely. He knelt beside Walter's chair. Walter, there's a phone number here. They're looking for you. Your family is looking for you. Do you want me to call them? Walter took Jake's hand in both of his, the same way he had that first night in the alley, except now his grip was steady. Yes, he said. Yes, please. Call them. But Jake, his eyes locked onto the young man's face with sudden clarity. Whatever happens after this call, whatever they offer you, whatever they say, I need you to know that you saved my life. Not just from the cold. You treated me like a person when I couldn't even remember my own name. That matters more than any of it. Jake's hands shook as he dialed the tip line. The woman who answered identified herself as part of Daniel Whitfield's office. And the moment Jake described Walter his age, his confusion, the coat, the location, her voice shifted from professional calm to barely contained urgency. Please don't move, she said. Please, stay exactly where you are. Someone will be there within the hour. And sir, her voice cracked slightly. Thank you. Thank you for keeping him safe. Jake hung up the phone and looked at Walter, who was watching him with an expression Jake couldn't quite name, something between gratitude and a kind of fierce, protective affection that didn't make sense for two people who'd known each other less than a day. They're coming, Jake said quietly. Walter nodded, squeezing his hand one more time. I know, son, and I'm not going to let them forget what you did for me. Not ever. 40 minutes later, two black SUVs pulled up outside Jake's apartment building, And the reunion that followed would bring an entire room of powerful, hardened business people to tears. Jake heard the cars before he saw them, engines cutting the silence of the quiet street, doors slamming in rapid succession. He looked out his window to see Maria Lopez moving quickly up the front steps, flanked by 2 police officers, and a man Jake recognized instantly from the news broadcast, Daniel Whitfield. Daniel didn't wait to be let in properly. He pushed past the opening door the moment Jake cracked it, eyes scanning the small apartment until they landed on his grandfather, sitting alive and warm at a stranger's kitchen table. "Grandpa!" Daniel's voice broke completely on the word. He crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to his knees beside Walter's chair, gripping the old man's hands like he might vanish if he let go. "I thought I lost you. I thought you were gone. I thought—" "I'm here, Daniel." Walter's voice was thick with tears, but clearer and stronger than it had been in days. "I'm here because of him." He nodded toward Jake, who stood frozen near the doorway, suddenly feeling very small in his worn delivery uniform. Daniel slowly rose to his feet and turned to face. Jake really looked at him the way you look at someone whose actions you're trying to understand. The torn sneakers held together with tape, the hollow exhaustion under his eyes, the complete absence of anything in this apartment that suggested Jake had anything to spare for anyone, let alone a stranger. "You found him in an alley," Daniel said slowly, his voice rough. "2 nights ago. Freezing. Confused. And you brought him here. Gave him your bed, your food, your coat." "He needed help," Jake said simply, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't going to leave him out there." "Most people did," Maria said quietly from the doorway. Detective Ramirez confirmed at least 6 other people walked past that alley in the hours before you found him. Security footage caught all of it. Daniel's eyes filled with tears he didn't bother hiding. He extended his hand toward Jake, not the practiced, professional handshake of a CEO, but something more human, more grateful, the handshake of a grandson, thanking the person who'd given his family back its most important member. "My grandfather built an entire company on the belief that you judge a person's character by how they treat people who can't do anything for them in return," Daniel said. "Tonight, you proved he was right about everything." Walter, still seated, looked between the 2 young men, his grandson, who he'd raised like a son, and Jake, who had asked for absolutely nothing in return for saving his life. "Daniel," Walter said firmly, "whatever you're about to offer this boy, and I know you're about to offer him something, I can see it in your face, it isn't going to be enough. Not for what he did. Not even close." What Daniel offered Jake that night would change his life completely, but it was nothing compared to what was about to happen at the next board meeting, when a man named Richard Hale would try to twist this entire story into a weapon. Daniel sat down across from Jake at the small card table, the same table where Walter had eaten crackers just hours earlier, and for a long moment, nobody said anything. "I want to do something for you," Daniel finally said, "not as charity, as a thank you that still won't come close to covering what you did." Jake shook his head, embarrassed. "Mr. Whitfield, I really don't need— I know you don't need anything from me," Daniel interrupted gently. "That's exactly why you deserve it." He glanced at Maria, who already had a notepad out. "I want a position created for Jake at Whitfield Foods. Logistics and community outreach. He clearly understands this city's streets and its people better than anyone on my current staff. Full salary, full benefits, starting whenever he's ready." Jake's mouth went dry. "Sir, I don't have a college degree. I dropped out after 2 semesters. I don't have any of the qualifications for— My grandfather didn't have a college degree either," Daniel said, glancing at Walter with a small, sad smile. "He had a delivery truck and a stubborn belief that hard work and decency mattered more than a piece of paper. I think you have that same stubborn belief, Jake." Walter reached across the table and gripped Jake's hand. "Let him do this, son. Not because you need saving, because he needs to do it. Let an old man's family give something back to the world the way I once had to." Maria cleared her throat gently. "There's something else, Jake. We did some background work this afternoon while the family was searching. Your mother, Linda Carter. Detroit Mercy Hospital. Stage 2 breast cancer. Jake's heart stopped. How do you... Detective Ramirez ran a standard background check as part of the investigation. Maria explained carefully. It's not something we usually share, but given the circumstances, Mr. Whitfield felt you should know her remaining treatment. All of it is covered. Past bills included. It's already being processed with the hospital's billing department. Jake's eyes filled with tears he had been holding back for months, not from the exhaustion of the past 2 days, but from months and months of carrying a weight that had finally, impossibly, been lifted. I don't know what to say, Jake whispered. You don't have to say anything, Walter said softly, his thumb brushing across the back of Jake's hand the way a grandfather might comfort a grandson. You already said everything that mattered 2 nights ago, in that alley. But not everyone at Whitfield Foods was happy about a delivery driver suddenly receiving the company's gratitude, and 3 days later, in a boardroom on the 40th floor, a man named Richard Hale would try to turn Jake's kindness into a scandal. Richard Hale had been a thorn in Daniel Whitfield's side since the day Walter handed over the company. A major shareholder with a board seat and an old grudge, Walter had passed him over for the CEO position twice, decades earlier, choosing instead to mentor and eventually promote younger talent, and finally his own grandson. 3 days after Walter's safe return, Richard called an emergency board meeting under the guise of fiduciary concerns regarding recent expenditures. I want to be clear, Richard began, addressing the boardroom table of 12 executives, that I am, of course, relieved Mr. Whitfield was found safe. But I have serious concerns about how this situation has been handled. We have a young man, no professional background, no verifiable employment history beyond gig delivery work, suddenly receiving a corporate position and, from what I understand, full medical coverage for a family member, all approved without board consultation. Daniel's jaw tightened. Richard, that young man found my grandfather freezing in an alley and brought him into his own home at personal risk and personal cost. Or, Richard said, his tone deliberately measured, a young man recognized a confused, wealthy, elderly individual, isolated him in his apartment for over 12 hours before contacting authorities, and positioned himself perfectly to receive a substantial reward and a guaranteed job. I'm not accusing anyone of anything, Daniel. I'm simply saying due diligence matters, especially given Mr. Whitfield's current medical condition and his ability to consent to these arrangements. The room went silent. Maria, sitting beside Daniel, felt her stomach drop because legally Richard's concern, twisted as it was, held just enough weight to be dangerous. Walter's diagnosed dementia meant any decision he made could theoretically be challenged. It was Walter himself who broke the silence. He had insisted on attending the meeting, despite Daniel's gentle protest that he should rest. Now he rose slowly from his chair at the head of the table, and the entire room fell silent out of decades of respect. Richard, Walter said, his voice steady and clear in a way it hadn't been in days. I may forget many things. I forgot my own name in that alley. I forgot how to get home. But I will never, for as long as I have left in this mind, forget what kindness looks like when it costs someone everything they have. He looked around the table at every board member. That young man gave a stranger his coat in 11-degree weather. He gave away a meal he needed for himself. He sat up all night in a kitchen chair to make sure I kept breathing, when he had every reason in the world to walk past me and protect himself instead. Walter's voice cracked with emotion. If you want to question someone's character in this room, Richard, I'd suggest you start with your own. Richard Hale wasn't finished, and what he did next would force Jake into the one place he never wanted to be, standing in front of the entire Whitfield board, defending his own honesty. Linda Carter's recovery had been slow but steady. The cancer treatment, now fully funded and no longer a source of constant financial terror, had finally turned a corner. Her oncologist, Dr. Patel, reported shrinking tumor markers and a treatment plan that, for the first time since her diagnosis, included real hope instead of cautious uncertainty. Walter had insisted on visiting her personally, much to Daniel's nervous protests about his grandfather's energy levels and so. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, Walter sat beside Linda's hospital bed while Jake hovered near the door, still slightly in awe of the entire situation. "Mrs. Carter," Walter said warmly, "I wanted to meet the woman who raised a son like Jake. I have a feeling I owe you my life just as much as I owe it to him." Linda, thin but smiling, reached for Walter's hand. "Please, call me Linda. And Mr. Whitfield, you don't owe us anything. Jake did what I raised him to do. What anybody decent should do. Most people don't, though," Walter said quietly. "I've learned that the hard way these past few weeks. Most people walk past." Linda studied the old man for a long moment, the kindness in his tired eyes, the way he looked at her son with something like genuine affection rather than obligation. "You remind me of my father," she said softly. "He used to say that kindness was the only investment that never lost its value, no matter what the economy did." Walter's eyes filled with tears. "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was." Linda squeezed his hand. "I think Jake found the right person to help that night, Mr. Whitfield. I think you two were meant to find each other." Jake, watching from the doorway, felt something shift in his chest, a feeling he didn't quite have words for yet. He'd spent so long believing that kindness was a luxury he couldn't afford, something for people who had enough left over to spare. Watching his exhausted, recovering mother hold hands with a billionaire's grandfather, both of them crying over a shared belief in basic human decency, he understood for the first time that he'd had it backwards all along. Kindness wasn't what you gave away from abundance. It was what you gave even when you had nothing else left, and somehow, impossibly, it always came back around. But Walter's disease wasn't finished with him yet, and 3 weeks later, during what should have been a celebration, Walter would forget every single person in the room except for one. The days after that Sunday dinner felt different, not because Walter's dementia had suddenly improved. It hadn't. If anything, the episode frightened everyone enough to make them face what they had been quietly avoiding. Walter's condition was progressing. For Daniel, that realization hit hardest. For years, he had treated his grandfather's diagnosis like a problem to solve. Hire better doctors, find better specialists, research better treatments, work harder, spend more money. But sitting on the floor beside Walter's chair that night, watching his grandfather stare into his face without recognition, Daniel finally understood something no amount of money could fix. Time was winning. 3 nights later, Daniel sat alone in Walter's study long after everyone else had gone home. The walls were lined with photographs spanning nearly 5 decades of Whitfield Foods history. Walter standing beside his first delivery truck. Walter shaking hands with warehouse workers. Walter teaching a teenage Daniel how to read financial reports. Walter laughing at a company picnic with employees whose names he still remembered years later. Daniel stared at the photographs until nearly midnight. Then he made a decision. The next morning, he called Maria. "I want Jake here," Daniel said. "At headquarters?" Maria asked. "Not just headquarters, everywhere." Maria frowned. "I'm not sure I understand." Daniel looked through the office window toward the city below. "My grandfather remembers Jake when he forgets everyone else. He trusts him. He feels safe with him." Maria's expression softened. "You think Jake helps ground him?" "I know he does." 2 days later, Jake received an invitation to lunch at Whitfield Tower. He assumed it was work-related. He couldn't have been more wrong. When he arrived, Walter was already there, sitting beside Daniel in a private dining room overlooking the Detroit skyline. "Jake!" Walter's face brightened instantly. The reaction alone told Daniel everything he needed to know. His grandfather had spent most of the morning struggling to remember appointments and repeating questions. But the moment Jake walked through the door, recognition came immediately. "Good to see you, Walter," Jake said with a smile. Walter reached out and squeezed his shoulder. "Always good to see you, son." Daniel waited until lunch was finished before finally speaking. "Jake, I need to ask you something." Jake looked up. "Sure." Daniel glanced toward his grandfather, then back at Jake. "I want to create a new position." Jake groaned dramatically. "Daniel, We've already been through this. You gave me a job. Daniel laughed despite himself. No, this is different. The room fell quiet. I want you to become my grandfather's special assistant and companion. Jake blinked. What? Walter looked equally surprised. Daniel leaned forward. I'm serious. Travel with him when he wants to visit facilities. Join him for meetings when he's comfortable attending. Help him keep track of appointments. Be there on difficult days. Jake stared at him. Daniel, there are professionals for that. There are caregivers. Daniel agreed. There are nurses. There are specialists. He paused. But there is only one person I've ever seen calm him down when the disease takes hold. Walter lowered his eye. The silence that followed carried a sadness nobody wanted to acknowledge. Finally, Walter spoke. Jake. Jake turned toward him. When I was lost, you found me. Walter's voice trembled. When I was afraid, you stayed. His eyes glistened. And when my own mind couldn't hold on to who I was anymore, somehow it still held on to you. Jake felt his throat tighten. Walter reached across the table and took his hand. I don't know how much time I have before this disease takes more pieces away. The old man smiled sadly. But I'd like whatever time is left to include family. Jake's eyes filled with tears. Family? The word hung in the room. Not employee. Not assistant. Not charity case. Family. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Jake nodded. Okay. Walter smiled. Daniel smiled. And for the first time since that terrible night of confusion, hope returned to the room. None of them knew it yet. But that decision would change the future of both families forever. Because 6 months later, Walter Whitfield would make one final announcement that would shock the board, stun the shareholders, and leave Jake Carter completely speechless. 2 days after that frightening Sunday, Daniel called Jake and asked him to come to the office, not the boardroom this time, but his private study, quiet and informal. I need to ask you something, Daniel said. And I need you to be honest with me. Of course, Jake said. My grandfather's disease is progressive. The doctors say there will be more days like Sunday. More days where he doesn't know me. Where he doesn't know anyone. Daniel's voice was raw. Except, it seems, you, even at his most confused, something about that coat, about that night reaches him when nothing else can. Jake didn't know what to say. I want to ask you to be part of his care team, Daniel continued. Not officially, not as a job requirement. I know that's not fair to ask of you. But Walter trusts you in a way I haven't seen him trust anyone outside our family. If you're willing, and only if you're willing, I'd like you to spend time with him regularly. As a friend. As whatever this has become between you two. Jake thought about it for only a moment before answering. Daniel, I wasn't planning on going anywhere anyway. Walter's not just a job to me, or a thank you note that turned into a paycheck. He's my friend. I'd be there every Sunday whether you asked me to or not. Daniel's composure finally broke, and he pulled Jake into a hug. Two young men, raised by different worlds, bound together now by the same fierce love for the same remarkable old man. There's one more thing, Daniel said, wiping his eyes. My grandfather wants to set up something in his name while he's still able to understand and approve of it himself. A foundation. He wants to call it Walter's Coat. He explained. A city-wide initiative providing warm coats, hot meals, and emergency shelter resources to homeless individuals across Detroit during the winter months, funded permanently by Whitfield Foods, run in large part by Jake himself, who understood the city's forgotten corners better than any executive in that boardroom ever could. He wants you to run it, Daniel said. Officially. Full-time. Full salary, full authority, to build it however you think it should be built. Jake thought of every person he'd ever driven past, delivering food to warm, comfortable apartments while someone shivered in an alley 2 blocks away. He thought of how close he'd come to walking past Walter that night too, how easily. On a different night, with a little less left in him to give, he might have. Yes, Jake said without hesitation. 1,000 times, yes. A year later, on a quiet Sunday evening, a moment would unfold that proved some bonds run deeper than memory itself. even deeper than the disease trying so hard to take it all away. A year had passed. Linda Carter had been declared fully cancer-free in the spring, ringing the bell at Detroit Mercy Hospital, surrounded by Jake, Dorothy, Maria, and sitting in a wheelchair, brought along just for the occasion, Walter. Clapping louder than anyone in the room. Walter's Coat Foundation had distributed over 4,000 winter coats and 40,000 hot meals across Detroit in its first year alone. With Jake at the helm, still driving the city's forgotten streets himself most weekends, just with a company badge now, instead of a delivery app login. Richard Hale had quietly resigned from the board 6 months earlier, after an internal review found several of his prior business dealings had not been as clean as his criticism of Jake had implied. And every single Sunday, without fail, Jake and Linda still came to Walter's home for dinner. Walter's disease had continued its slow, cruel progression. Some Sundays, he knew everyone in the room, laughing and telling old stories about his first delivery truck like no time had passed at all. Other Sundays, he knew no one, not Daniel, not Maria, sometimes not even his own face in the mirror. But there was one thing the disease had never once managed to take. Every single time, without exception, the moment Jake walked through the door, coat in hand, the same simple style he'd worn that very first night, something in Walter's eyes would clear, even if only for a moment. "There he is," Walter would say, every single time, with the same warmth as if it were the very first time he'd ever said it. "The boy who gave a stranger his coat. They say you never know whose life you're touching when you stop to help a stranger." Jake didn't save Walter because he knew who he was. He saved him because, on a freezing night with almost nothing left to give, he chose to give anyway. And in the end, that's the only kind of kindness that ever truly matters. The kind that asks for nothing, expects nothing, and gives everything it has left. Somewhere tonight, in your city, there is someone cold, someone forgotten, someone who just needs one person to stop walking and start seeing them. Be that person. You never know whose grandfather you might be saving.